All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. This is part 2 of my conversation with Antonio Garcia Martinez, best-selling author of Chaos Monkeys, and also somebody with a fairly interesting point of view on Silicon Valley. That is not your brand X Silicon Valley political line. Very interesting guy, best-selling author. Here's our conversation. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. Here's part 2 of my conversation with Antonio Garcia Martinez. In my opinion, by the time you're 30, you should be like, oh yeah, okay, how do you build the roads? There's still people in Silicon Valley who think that's like the best thing they've heard. And when you look at it, you're like, it's, yeah, you got successful and you're writing a narrative that you caused it all. And it's like, come on. Like, you really are you're a billion times richer. You're really a billion times smarter than ever. Like, that probably isn't the case.
Right. I think part of it is the fact that there's no civic mindedness there, right? Like, they don't understand exactly how do the roads get built.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the internet was a government project to begin with.
Yeah, right.
Like, no corporation would ever have done this bizarre,
Yeah.
at least at the time, this weird moonshot thing of like, oh, let's network computers because we think it's cool in the Cold War, right? And so, yeah, no, I think it's a little ridiculous. And the fact that, like, you rewind, a century and a half, and somebody like, Carnegie, for example, a massive steel fortune, he built a library in every American town, right?
Yeah.
In fact, some of the most beautiful libraries in the Bay Area, I think the one in Mission or the one in Oakland Public Library, there's these gorgeous structures that were actually just built as just an act of charity to the nation, right?
Yeah.
And like, I've yet to be treated in a Google hospital, right? Or my kid doesn't go to a
Although
Google
you've been treated in a Benioff hospital, maybe. Like
yes.
I feel like there's a few guys, now maybe they're just...
Well, Benioff, is one, and Zuckerberg's another, to be clear.
Yeah.
Who donated a lot of money. That's right.
And there's a few people, and Mark Benioff in particular is pretty good about saying, look, all these causes are important, global health's important and all that, but you guys should also be giving to your local communities too. We should be worried about Africa, but there's people here that need your help.
Right.
Bill Gates is pretty good about it. Like, he does, and I don't know if he really believes this, but he does say, like, look, I didn't do this in Africa. Like, I didn't do this in Nigeria. I got rich because my parents were here and I was here and this was happening, and I'm a smart guy and a bunch of things happened, but I didn't do this in Nigeria, which is I think why his foundation does things, which are the big projects, where he's like, look, all this stuff, like, you want to send medicine and stuff like that, but you need a road to get the medicine in, and that's a project that I need to do with Warren Buffett, our money together, and the governments together, like those massive projects. But yeah, there's definitely this crazy streak of libertarianism in Silicon Valley. I just think it's based on.
But it's not even true libertarianism, right? Because like, I was mildly sympathetic to the Johnson candidacy, actually. Yeah. And I think in certain states, now that I'm like a self-reliant rural Washingtonian, right? Yeah. Like there's a certain libertarian streak, which I understand. Like, I think in that context, it tends to work, right? Even though people still pay for roads, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, it's funny, I mentioned I bought land, but I got my first property tax bill. And it's actually itemized like a restaurant receipt, which I didn't know because I've like never owned land or like property. Yeah. And so it's like literally like fire district number 2, schools, the cemetery, the airport.
That's great.
The county general fund, which is mostly the sheriff's deputies, and like there's like 6 things that I pay for. Yeah. Right. So like the basics get paid for, right? It's not like no one would say like don't pay for the road. Yeah. Right. But I think more than that, I think it's literally just opportunism, basically. They just don't want to give back. And there's no one in San Francisco is from here, right? Right. There's no feeling of like civic debt or we want to improve this. Like, we're like, I think I've said it before, we've been living in like the biggest scene of legal wealth creation since like the Medicis, right? Yeah, and yet there's no Doge's Palace, there's nothing to remember, there's no civic anything, right? Yeah. I mean, the Medicis, they paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, right? But that doesn't exist here, right? It's just no one feels that sense of debt. They reinvest in other tech companies, which is great, and that's what keeps the show going. Yeah. But there's not much beyond that.
Yeah, so my sense on missing the election, like I took more of a black box approach to it, which was, first of all, the odds. Like the betting odds were always like 25%, and yet people were behaving like they were 0, which in my mind is one of the big, to the extent that the media did anything wrong. I talked to somebody who worked at the Chronicle, and he kind of bristles at the idea that they didn't cover Trump fairly. He's like, we fact-checked him, we called him a liar, he's like, I don't know what else we could have said negative about the guy. But the one thing they did do is they did give you the sense that the path to his victory was like 0%, which I think might have enabled a lot of the I'm going to write in John Oliver and I'm going to, stay home because they're both bad and that kind of behavior.
I
And a lot of the language was things like, oh, he's not qualified, and that, which I think might have confused some people, which I know what they meant, but there's only 2 qualifications, and one is he'd be a U.S. citizen, and one is he'd be 35. Right. You can be any kind of anything else after that. Maybe a felon. I don't even know if that's one of the requirements. So. Right.
I mean, I think where the media was complicit, and I think you still see it in the coverage of Trump, is that they view it very much through that sort of leftist eye of like, just cite one concrete example, the whole Mexican rapist thing that Trump said, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and yet 30% of the U.S. Hispanic vote voted for Trump. Yeah, right. So clearly they were rather less offended about it than most San Francisco residents, right? And so clearly whatever they were ingesting from Trump, unless you think they're not capable of making their own political decisions, which by the way, in some of the commentary, I think that's probably true. I think people in San Francisco probably think that. But assuming that's not true, which I don't think it is, what they were parsing with Trump was obviously very different, right? They were seeing something else in him that was not that, right? Yeah. And I think if you actually, went through the marathon, suffered through the indignity of actually listening to an entire Trump speech from the time, you realize that most of it actually wasn't even about race, right? I mean, clearly he drew the KKK Confederate contingent, but they'd vote Republican no matter what. Like they'd show up in that tent, doesn't matter what Trump would say, right? Yeah. But I think the average American, that wasn't actually the appeal of Trump, right? Yeah. Which doesn't mean their motivations were more rational, right? Obviously, it's a vote against the system, it's anti-Hillary hate, it's lots of things, right? But like the fact that journalist from the Chronicle or whatever couldn't even begin to see the appeal or begin to empathize with their enemy, understand why Trump would be appealing to him, I think they actually were complicit in that. And I think their reporting on Trump was actually pretty crappy in general.
That's it. I did that early on. For some reason, I was in a hotel room stuck somewhere and watched a whole Trump speech. Right. And I was like, man, and there was the 30 seconds of the thing that I'm sure showed up on John Oliver.
Right, exactly.
But 90% of it, I was like, I'm not into it. But I could see somebody being at that rally and really getting excited and having laughing about something, and I get it. Right. And if you are just watching that 1 30-second clip, you're like, oh my God,
this guy is Hitler. Yeah. It's like, well, no.
Yeah. Right. The rest of the time he was like talking about stuff and reacting to the crowd like a good preacher, basically.
Right.
And I just, to me, the thing that I was like, okay, the 10th time Donald Trump said something and it didn't have this devastating impact that everybody imagined, nobody seemed to make that adjustment. Nobody seemed to say, oh, it seems like every time he says something that contradicts something else, he's against China, but his stuff's made in China, ha, 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 and nothing happens, maybe that stuff isn't effective.
Right.
And yet what you would see, like, here, come on Facebook, here it is, oh my God, here's here's Bill Maher's take on the... Right. Well, clearly... a lot of people don't give a fuck about hypocrisy. Don't know why. It may not be right, but it seems to be the case. So now what's your plan? Right. And the plan just seemed to be like double indignation on the next outrage. Right. That's the part that got, it seems to me the Democrats or somebody should have been like, I don't know, man, this ain't working. Right.
Well, I think maybe they didn't realize they were preaching to the choir, right? I mean, those messages were meant for their own audience to rile up the faithful, but that doesn't convince someone to not vote for them, right?
Right.
And, if you look at the Trump results, I mean, what were the Midwestern states that voted for Trump? Wisconsin, Michigan.
Ohio, Indiana.
Right, Indiana, states that voted for Obama before, voted for a black man before.
Well, they're all racist. So, yeah, maybe, but somehow that racist group all voted for Obama.
Right, and lest we forget, in the Iowa primary, 60% of GOP voters voted for either 2 Hispanics or a black man, right? Yeah. And so if they're the racist, and that's never happened in the Democratic Party. Yeah. So if they're the racist party, how do you explain that, right? Yeah. And Nikki Haley, who's so evil, is like this Indian woman, right? And I don't see a blue state run by an Indian woman. And so I think that indignation thing. I mean, the reality is, and I hate to use the term, but the post-truth world, right? Yeah. Like, you don't actually convince people with facts, right? You convince them with emotions. And the reality is the left has its own hypocritical pieties that it refuses to examine, right? And around which their reaction to pointing out the hypocrisy would be the same as Trump supporters, which is like, well, either you can't say that or screw it and carry on, right? And so it just seems odd that I think both sides are actually kind of crazy. That's my conclusion from it.
Well, I think now I also think the Republicans kind of they're just playing loose. Like they just seem to have the Democrats' number right now because the fake news thing came along, which is the same narrative. It's like these people who voted for Trump just didn't understand. That's what it was. If they only knew the truth and we're getting, it's like, okay, maybe. Although all the fake news is negative about Donald Trump and positive about Hillary Clinton.
Right.
But a mile away, the Republicans saw that. They're like, oh, yeah, there's fake news. CNN,
right.
New York Times. And the fakest news of all is that Hillary Clinton's a guaranteed lock to win.
Right.
You're like, oh, man, you guys just keep falling for this. Like, the football every time, like, that's not it. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but it's not like pointing out the foibles of Donald Trump. For some reason, that just wasn't it.
Well, maybe the solution would have been someone on the left who had that similar ability to actually rally mass emotional appeal.
Yeah.
And and maybe somebody like Bernie Sanders, for example, rather than sinking him, maybe he would have been the guy to run against Trump, for example.
It might have been. I mean, in fairness, nobody was thinking that this was such a big possibility, but clearly, like, that wasn't right thinking.
Right.
But I think that probably is more the answer. It's like, look, you have to get people excited. They're not going to get no one's getting bound up in the, he said this one day and that the other day. That just isn't working. I don't know why. And my kind of black box thing is like, you talk to people and say, hey, 44% of people say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. Like, oh, they're all racist. Like, okay. He wins at 48. So what is your understanding of people that you understand the 44, but you know it's not going to be 48?
Right.
It's like, that doesn't sound like a level of intelligence that anybody that I know would have. Like, that just seems crazy.
Right. And then the whole racist thing, to think that like 40% of the United States is literally like Confederate flag waving people. It's like, dude, I think you need to get on a plane to the flyover states and realize that's not quite true.
I mean, I think the racists probably voted for Donald Trump as well. But I always, whenever I heard the wall thing, and everyone said it was like a dog whistle for racism, I'm like, no, I think it's a dog whistle for job stealers.
Right.
Like, and that's probably not true as well. But I think when they hear wall, they're like, keep out the job stealing people.
Right.
Even those people are probably in China and not in Mexico or whatever. Right. That's what it was a dog whistle for. And you could hear the anti-Mexican thing, but that doesn't seem like that's going to motivate so many people.
No. I mean, to me, Trump, I think the wall thing was really a vote against globalization, a borderless nation, optimizing things for global capitalism. And to me, Trump is like almost equivalent to Brexit in that it's that class of people saying, no, we're not going to be part of this massive system.
Or we're going to slow it down for a while.
We're going to slow it down, exactly.
Like as much as we can.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you think so Silicon Valley, so everyone kind of went into this joint funk in Silicon Valley. Fair enough. I mean, they didn't get their person and have now piled it into this one glob of like 2016 is the worst. Like, I think George Michael died last week.
Right.
Terrible, unfortunate. Sure. A few of my friends were like, that's it. Like, I can't wait for 2016 to be over. Like,
like the human health clock restarts on Jan 1.
That was it. Like that. Okay, now you're just being like this is the worst, the worst you've ever seen it. Like the stock market's up and your family's healthy and happy, but
we're not at war.
Yeah, we're not at war. Like, didn't George Michael really threw you over the edge? Like, now you're just you're piling on.
Right.
Remember the year that Princess Diana died, and the Queen of England, I guess, gives a speech to the people every year.
Right. Annus Horribilis.
Yes, Annus Horribilis, and she said, "It is not a year upon which I will look back with undiluted pleasure." So, I guess that's
the queenly retort.
That describes us.
That sucked. That's the translation of that.
That is. That's just such a queen-like way to say that. So where do you think Silicon Valley is on this now? Do you think it's? I mean, we were it was to the barricades every night for the first week was the idea. Now
wank.
Now it's like the difficulty with raising a Series A is
Well, I think what Silicon Valley, I don't know if it's realizing it, but what it needs to realize is that although it has a lot of commercial and technical power, it has almost no political power whatsoever, right? I mean, that Trump meeting, I don't know how different people might have parsed it a different way, but that teal arranged Trump meeting,
where with a bunch of people like Sheryl Sandberg showed up,
and Larry Page and Bezos, like knowing Trump being the narcissist that he is, that's obviously meant to humiliate them to some degree, I suspect.
Yeah.
Just like the meeting with Romney, I'm sure he had no intention of giving Romney the same position whatsoever. Yeah. It was just to get the guy to grovel, basically.
Yeah.
And they basically just went to the meeting and keeled over, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem with this sort of like really sort of self-centered, unprincipled commercialism, right? Yeah. They'll play with whatever regime is in power, and that's the reality of it, right?
Yeah.
And like the reality is there aren't a lot of principles in Silicon Valley. No one's willing to take a fucking hit for anything, right? No one's gonna. I mean, yeah. put their foot down and say, "Oh, I'm not going to the Trump meeting because this man's a whore." They all went to the meeting.
Did anybody, like Benioff didn't go? I don't know if he was invited.
Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, Dorsey didn't go.
He wasn't invited. We heard. And so did Jeff Bezos go?
He did. Yeah, he was there. Yeah,
was he?
Where there was that famous photo of him, Page, and Sheryl Sandberg all looking like they just swallowed a bug. Yeah. Because I'm sure Trump had just said some stupidity.
Looking like he swallowed a dollop of ice cream or something lovely. Like
that, yeah.
Like this is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like the Silicon Valley is not quite at the barricades.
I mean, how would they even act, right? Yeah. They're in a blue state. Which, it's funny, everyone now is like a constitutional scholar advocating against the Electoral College. Yeah. And I wonder if they actually want that, because they look at an electoral map of California. California's half red, actually. Right? Yeah. So if California went proportional, them couldn't actually just assume.
Well, that's the denial stage of death.
Right, exactly.
California's going to exit the union, I think, is the next version of that.
And like not more than a year ago, we'd make fun of those Texas hayseeds for proposing leaving the union. Yeah. But now Calexis is a perfectly rational form of political sort of.
Exactly.
But you
just have to figure out, like, do we have enough of the military here? I'm not sure. Like, we've got the Navy, but do we have enough play?
Well, Governor Moonbeam seems to think so, right? I mean, he gave that rousing speech and said, "Well, we'll launch our own damn satellites to examine global warming or whatever." So,
man. Yeah, there was a book I read in high school, something Ecotopia. Did you read that book?
No, I know what you're talking about.
It was some fantasy where the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, it's some liberal fantasy, break off into this magical eco thing. The Cal exit thing completely reminds me of that. But yeah, I mean, I think people are getting a little more engaged in their local politics. Gavin Newsom actually is here at the Founders Den where we spend our time. He'll be running. But I've just been fascinated. I mean, my Facebook feed for the few days after Trump won was just like paragraphs of prose about how horrible it was and how we're going to be out at the barricades every night. And that seems to have. I guess you can get used to anything.
And yet nobody moved to Canada, despite all the promises.
No.
The joke of like, when are you moving to Vancouver just does not get old to me. Like, somehow Lena Dunham and Schumer and everybody else are still here.
It's still better than the alternative. Well, what do you think happens next for Silicon Valley's back to business as normal? Does more
Nothing
money
happens.
Go into politics?
They're still going to accept teal term sheets. Nothing will change.
That is true.
Nothing's going to change.
What was one of the Facebook guys, Eduardo? No, it wasn't Eduardo. One of them gave a bunch of money to Hillary Clinton shortly before the election.
Moskowitz, I think, right?
Yeah, but it was like $35 million, which I understand to him is relatively nothing. But it's a pretty big chunk to give of a sudden really late in the game. Did he know something? Like, did the word go out that there's like trouble or?
Yeah, I don't know. But, I wonder that it's weird. People in Silicon Valley are kind of naive in that they get really engaged in presidential elections. Yeah. But I bet 99% of Silicon Valley people couldn't tell you who one of California's senators are, or certainly who their representative is, right? Yeah. And so they kind of remind me of like either Green Party or Libertarian voters. Like I don't know if you saw Dan Savage had this like savage take, basically like completely shitting on Jill Stein voters and Gary Johnson voters, saying, look, if you actually want to build a third party alternative, you begin locally by electing local Green or Libertarian candidates, and from that you build a national base. You don't float some unicorn pie in the sky thing, just take away from the national vote and then just disappear, pack it up for 4 years, right?
And there are something like 500,000 or some crazy number of elected positions in the country.
Right.
Like just school board and like there's a ton.
Like, not that I look to Europe for much, I think they kind of screw up a lot of things, but a lot of their political culture is often very good. I mean, for example, again, my other citizenship, Spain. I don't know how familiar you are with Spanish politics, but there's the new left-wing party called Podemos, whatever. Yeah. It's kind of like the Bernie Sanders of Spain. Yeah. They went from literally just like, the Occupy Oakland type crap of like occupying a city square to the national party that won the most recent national elections in the span of a year or two, because they actually did have a level of national organization and rhetoric and leadership that actually got them there. And somehow that doesn't exist here, right? Yeah. There's no pirate party in Silicon Valley, for example, that would advocate. And I understand that part of it's because the U.S. doesn't have a parliamentary system, so there aren't coalition politics. Right. There aren't a bunch of little minor parties. But nonetheless, like why don't we have some weird, hell, Bernie Sanders, right? Social select in Vermont. Why don't we have a pirate guy in like whatever the San Jose's congressional district is, right? And who advocates for those values and is a voice in that national conversation, right? I don't know. I wish we did, right? And if this Trump defeat has any silver lining, it's that Silicon Valley, which absolutely does have the money and the wherewithal to do this, goes ahead and actually does that.
Yeah. I wish that was more the conclusion. It's just become more like George Soros or the Koch brothers. Just like look at the map and figure out the I mean, the problem is like half of the people in the blue states just need to move to Wyoming and all these states, and that would solve it. So everyone's just sorting themselves into these big cities, and then their votes are just, flying away worthless.
Getting averaged out by electoral college,
Yeah, in the big elections. But I actually, my state senator, Scott Wiener, who's my local supervisor, I went to a thing and I gave him like, $100 and a couple, whatever it was, and he won. It was like, it was pretty satisfying. I don't know what he's going to do. He's going to make sure the sewers get fixed in San Francisco or we get the money we need. I mean, he's not going to set nuclear policy or immigration, or maybe he will, but it was pretty satisfying. And I haven't really done that a lot until recently. I wish more people would kind of just realize how, first of all, you get to meet the guy.
Right.
He'll say hello, have a beer with him, actually. And it's a pretty satisfying thing. Like, that would be a nice lesson to take out versus more of the John Oliver. I even wonder sometimes if, like, John Oliver and Bill Maher
I think they're net negative.
Net negative because they convince you that you're so
right.
And they're right. I mean, a lot of he did say that and then that, and that's hypocritical. But it kind of people confuse that with the odds being low.
They are the echo in the echo chamber, right? All those links of like John Oliver destroys Trump over this. It's like, you know what? He didn't destroy him. He won, right? Turns out, right? And so, I think they do more harm than good, frankly.
Yeah, 0% of Trump supporters have ever watched a hot minute of John Oliver.
Right.
Well, so what's next for you in the coming year? What you're homesteading?
On the spot.
You're not writing a manifesto, are you?
No, absolutely not. I wouldn't presume to know how to fix this mess. No.
Well, don't manifestos always precede like some kind of break, and then you're in a clock tower.
Oh, God.
This guy's
Let's hope not. I mean, the only manifesto, the one thing that I've been thinking about writing a book about, and it might be a little cliche, is like, the whole AI automation crisis that I think is coming, right? The fact that a lot of jobs, whether it be in software or in robotics, are going to get sort of automated away, right? And, a lot of repetitive, either mechanical or cognitive tasks that just won't exist anymore. And I think that's a big problem that in the midst of all this political whatever, we haven't really talked about, and we're not really talking about.
Somebody needs to create like a venture capital AI that would be named Josh. It would
went to Stanford.
It would debate
in the Castilla school.
It would say random things about raising money. It's really easy to raise money. It's really hard to raise money.
It would wear a wool zippy like this one.
Yeah, exactly.
And bonobo slack like I'm wearing.
And then get lucky every 15th investment. That's kind of been the big story of 2016 for me. Is kind of how quickly like driverless cars, because I was always like, that's going to be crazy someday.
Right.
And then all of a sudden there's really driverless cars, and all of a sudden they make a lot of sense.
Right.
And then someone says driverless trucks, and you're like, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And you're thinking like, maybe this is like 5 years away and not 20 years away. So that could be where the revolution comes from. And I assume that's why Silicon Valley is so getting hopped up on basic income.
Right.
It's just because you have to pay people to do this disruption.
Yeah, I mean, excuse the pun. I think a lot of the truck drivers don't see their truck about to hit them, right?
Right.
So if you go to their trucking forums, right? I mean, they kind of see this coming, right? I mean, they can read some of the tech rags too, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. They seem to, in many ways, I think, overstate the importance of the truck driver in the process. And I'm sure they know a lot of the operational details that a lot of the Silicon Valley people don't, right? Like things like snow are a major issue, put out chains, loads, shift. Yeah. I mean, there's all this stuff.
Security, I guess, might be one.
Which one?
Security, just like, if there's a driverless truck, can I just drive up to it and, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, right. Like it steals, right, exactly. So there's a bunch of stuff that I think that the techies aren't thinking about, but none of them seem like absolute technological roadblocks, right? Yeah. And I think they don't understand how soon a lot of that could actually come.
Well, and the inevitability, like just the sort of, sometimes economics just get too much to overcome. And if you're like, look, this truck could drive, the accident rates go down, the insurance rates go down. Right. They drive 24 hours a day instead of 23 hours a day instead of 10. They don't do whatever it is to keep awake and cause accidents. Like, it happens pretty quick.
That's right.
It isn't truck driver like the top job after
there's that
Walmart
map
in a lot of states.
Right. Well, there's that one map that shows it as being the top job in like 9 states that if you actually snopify it, it turns out they didn't properly account for some service jobs. Yeah. But it is the case that it's a shockingly large fraction of jobs. It's basically the one job that a high school educated male can still like have a house and feed a family on,
yeah.
right? There aren't a lot of those left.
Yeah.
And if that job goes away, then, we're talking like millions of people employed, not just the drivers, the families that feed them, the whole value chain of like gas station attendants, mechanics, like hotels along the way. I mean, we're an economy that's mostly truck driven, at least, within the U.S. And that's all kind of.
So you'd be writing about the social implications of AI.
Right. I think, there's a couple of good, I've read a lot of the sort of techie wonky books about it, like Second Machine Age. And stuff, and they're very good, and I don't think I'd ever improve on them. But I think it's more the human impact, like what's that trucker who's going to be out of a job going to do, or even the machinist, right? There's this company called Plethora that does basically CNC machining as a service, right? So you literally, before 3D printing got hot, and I'm not sure why 3D printing ever got hot, because it's actually not that great a manufacturing technology. There's this thing called CNC, which is a way of turning code into like a physical object that can actually work and be a part. And so they become like a SaaS version of that. And and I could cite lots of other examples of various companies that hell, there's a YC company called WeVorce that's basically an online divorce thing, right? Like why? Like divorce is the most formulaic thing in the world. Just go online, pay a couple $100, and done, right? Instead of this whole other thing. And so there go divorce lawyers, right? Like everybody, it's funny. I have a lot of friends that are outside of tech for various reasons, and every time they tell me what they do, like I can almost always think of some YC company that's trying to code them out of a job, right? Yeah. And like I don't think they realize it. Yeah. But I do, and it's just strange that it's like, well.
Yeah, I've always as an economics major, I forgot to ask this in college, but just the odds that all of the work in the world requires 95% of the world to do seems fairly unlikely.
Yeah, of course.
Like, why couldn't just 2% of us do it all? Or maybe it takes more people than we have.
Right. There's this great post by this anthropologist called On Bullshit Jobs by this anarchist rag. And it's a great, obviously it's a rhetorical take. It's not like an economist take on it. But it does seem like there's so many bullshit jobs around. The reality is that like you talk to so many people, including and especially well-paid white-collar jobs, right? In which like, dude, why does your job exist? A corporate lawyer, this shouldn't exist. This is bullshit. Like, what are you talking about?
But for sure, I get on the phone. We're a little 6-person company. You get on the phone with a company, we're talking to somebody, a publisher, and there'll be like 8 people in the room.
Right.
You're like, it can't possibly be the case that if 4 of you were gone tomorrow, your company...
half the work would get done. Half the revenue. Like, no, that's not true.
Anything would happen to your company.
Right.
Well, that book sounds great. It sounds like it's going to be of the moment if you do it.
We'll see. It means becoming like a tech reporter and like hunting down sources and being the guy with a notebook. It's a very
that sounds like work.
Different role to be in. I'll mention one other thing on the post-scarcity thing, which I think may be interesting, and it's a random thought. I'm reading. Do you know who Robert Sapolsky is? He was a MacArthur Genius Grant guy, TED guy. One of these sort of. And he lives in San Francisco, actually. He's a professor at Stanford. And he's made an entire 20, 30-year career of studying baboons, actually, in the Serengeti. And baboons are fascinating creatures for lots of reasons. They're matrilineal, unlike most primates, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting things is that the climate they live in is so temperate, right, the Serengeti, that like many pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer tribes, actually, they only need to work about 3 or 4 hours a day to feed themselves because it's not really a harsh environment. Yeah. And predators don't really mess with them because baboons are actually vicious creatures, and anyone messes with them, they just do them in. And so they only work about 3 hours a day. They're like almost like a basic income type situation. And what they do with the spare 12 hours a day is basically make each other's life complete fucking hell, right? Yes, because they just ruin each other's lives, which is the core of his research. He actually studies the stress response in baboons. Yeah. And it's a book called A Primate's Memoir. He has several books, but that's the one that recounts his actual. He's a great writer. If he hadn't got into baboon research, he missed his calling as a writer. But he describes, he tranquilizes them and then takes a blood sample and actually looks at their stress hormones and their level of stress, and along with it all sorts of, psychosomatic diseases. Yeah. They get ulcers and stuff, is basically a function of where you are in the status hierarchy, because the males are constantly combating each other and the women are exploiting the men for resources and the men are exploiting the women in various other ways. And it literally is this like Brazilian telenovela. Even though everyone could just like sit around and be happy and just like stare at the fucking moon and stars and be nice to each other, that's not what happens, right? And so the pessimistic side of me thinks that even if we actually get over this automation hump, and we get to a point where like most people actually don't have to work a lot for their everyday bread, we're still going to make our lives horrible, just like the baboons.
We'll just start a war.
Well, exactly.
Although the alternative is, I guess, there'd just be like a glut of really bad poetry.
But that's the best case scenario.
Yes, that's
right?
The best
like spoken word slams in every cafe.
Yeah.
That is the best case scenario. I think the worst case scenario is like 1,000 ISISes. That's actually what's going to happen.
Oh man. Yeah. Well, I hope you write that book.
So does my agent. Yes, I hope too as well.
Cool. Yeah. Well, this has been great. Thanks for doing this.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, best of luck in the new year too. 2017 is going to be way better. 2016 was fine too.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening. This has been the Something About Your podcast.